Thank you so much for joining us today at our NASA SEWP SCRM virtual forum presented by FCW and NASA SEWP. My name is Chris Riata, and I'm a staff writer for FCW. I cover government technology and procurement. And, when it comes to supply chain risk management, and more specifically, cybersecurity supply chain risk management, federal cyber leaders and government agencies have already been pushing forward with their initiatives to address vulnerabilities and prevent further incidents from compromising critical systems, all while attempting to ensure compliance with a new executive order and a range of guidance that is constantly being updated. But before those efforts can be successfully implemented, stakeholders must understand the full scope of current risks and learn new ways to combat those threats. And that's why I'm so excited to introduce our guests for this upcoming panel, which focuses really on the current state of SCRM and CSCRM efforts across government, so that we can really talk through some of that recent guidance from the White House, CISA, and NIST to determine best practices for ongoing and future initiatives. So without further ado, with me today is John Boyens, who is the Deputy Chief of the Computer Security Division in the Information Technology Lab at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. His responsibilities include cybersecurity research and development at NIST, as well as cybersecurity standards and guidelines for federal agency security programs. He also leads NIST's cyber supply chain risk management program, helps develop, coordinate the Department of Commerce's cybersecurity policy among the department bureaus, and he represents the department in the administration's interagency cybersecurity policy process. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. We also have with us Brian Papp, who serves as the Standards Area Lead for Cyber Supply Chain Risk Management at the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. In his current role, Brian has brought 200 government CSCRM subject matter experts together to illuminate supply chain shortcomings and use their insights to carve a collective path towards sharing information, strategic vision, as well as breaking down barriers between acquisition, cybersecurity, and risk for CSCRM. Brian, great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm also delighted to be joined today by Sarah Standard, the Director for Developmental Test, Evaluation, and Assessments at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering at the Department of Defense. Sarah is a 1988 U.S. Naval Academy graduate and a retired Navy captain, in addition to having previously worked as the Cybersecurity and Interoperability Technical Director at DoD before transitioning into her current role. Sarah, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great to have you. And last but certainly not least, we have Kenitra Tyler, NASA's Supply Chain Risk Management Service Owner. Kenitra has held a number of roles, including the GSFC Deputy Chief Information Security Officer and Program Manager of the inaugural IT Security Change Management Team. And in 2018, she was tapped to lead the agency's Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Service. She has now really set out to mature the agency's capability to make near real-time risk-based decisions and to create a culture of collaboration, efficiency, and compliance. Kenitra, thank you so much for being here.
And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So as you can tell, we have all of the key players on the panel today. So let's just get right into it. NIST has recently drafted a major revision to its cyber supply chain risk management practices for systems and organizations, which is much better known as SP 800-161. According to NIST, these updates are designed to better help organizations identify, assess, and respond to cyber supply chain risks, while still aligning with other fundamental NIST cybersecurity risk management guidance. The changes focus on making implementation guidance more modular and consumable for stakeholders, with a final version of these revisions due out in April. So, John, to start, I'm wondering, what more can you tell us about these revisions in SP 800-161? What are some of the most notable changes?
So our foundational publication was drafted or released back in 2015. The update reflects roughly 6 years of change in the kind of the federal ecosystem, industry, and just cybersecurity supply chain risk management overall. So the biggest change is probably the Secure Technology Act of 2018, which mandates departments and agencies implement different aspects of CSCRM, including risk assessments, managing that risk, etc. Develop the Federal Acquisition Security Council. So the release that we the draft that we released last April kind of reflected a lot of these changes. The second public draft is due to be released probably in the next week. And the changes that will be seen in there are from a 45-day public comment period where we listen to stakeholders. And probably one of the biggest comments that we, in terms of both the amount of comments as well as the substance, is the fact that we were trying to talk to too many different audiences and that a lot of the communication was getting lost. And part of that is we're trying to offer guidance that should really be 3D in a 2D format, right? So there's many ways of looking at organizational guidance, right? You can do a tier structure or you could do a role-based. And what we did is we tried to combine both of them. And I think in doing that, it was a little lost. So what we ended up doing, you'll see in what's released this week or next week, is that we created audience profiles. And so we have these little profiles that tell the different types of audiences where to go in the publication to find the information that is more specific to them, whether it's acquisition, IT operations, IT policy, what have you. And then the two other big changes were we created two new appendices, one to address the Secure Technology Act requirements regarding risk assessments, as well as the final rule of the Federal Acquisition Security Council, which requires information sharing from departments and agencies to the FASC. So that was one appendices where we kind of address risk assessments and risk prioritization, kind of a risk scoring. Then the second appendice addresses a requirement out of Executive Order 14028, Section 4C, which tells NIST to develop software supply chain security guidance. So we addressed that in this upcoming publication, and we talk about different aspects that NIST has already released, but we also talk about some of the emerging trends in software supply chain risk management that is touched on in the executive order, but not to a great detail. So we discuss software bill of materials, enhanced vendor risk assessments, open source software controls, and vulnerability management practices. So that's it in a nutshell.
Got it. I definitely want to get into the executive order as well. But before then, Brian, based on that critical work that NIST is really doing around 800-161, how is your team informing departments and agencies on how to implement core capabilities, which NIST has already begun to establish?
So thanks for that question. John and his team have done a lot of really, really great work over the years in really compiling great information for us to then take a look at and evaluate based on organizational needs. So, for example, we held a listening session with CFO Act agencies on CSCRM, really wanting to get down to the basis of what they needed in trying to develop a CSCRM program. And what we found out is that departments and agencies were really struggling with how to implement the controls. So NIST does controls. It says that I'm the standards area lead. I in no way do standards. That is John's lane. But what we decided to do through a CyberSig, which is a forum that we had developed, is bring a lot of information to them, this group of subject matter experts, and figure out what we needed to do with all of this information that we have compiled. So we decided, hey, why don't we start looking at developing some type of guidance for how departments and agencies can actually stand up a CSCRM program from an operational perspective, from a headquarters perspective. And there are a lot of different elements that are included in that, as well as special circumstances that deal with ICS systems. So we started pulling all of this information together, and we turned that into a pilot effort, which we're exploring how we get there based on a lot of the great work that NIST and John have put together. So that's kind of where we are right now. I can elaborate on the pilot a little bit later.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds fascinating. Would you mind kind of telling us, like, how exactly is that pilot being built out to inform organizations on sort of like the best ways to establish and sustain these CSCRM programs?
Sure, I can do that. So we decided to put this pilot together based on a significant need across the federal government. And what I did is I started courting a couple of departments and agencies and trying to get an idea of who would be a really good fit and trying to figure this out. I didn't want to get organizations that were like-minded. I wanted to have a diverse group of folks that were or organizations that were good at certain things, but not everybody being good at the same thing. So I selected or worked with NASA, worked with VA, Treasury, and Education, and brought them into this pilot. They were very excited about it because they're at various stages of program development for CSCRM. Some of them are really, really good, such as NASA and VA, and others are starting to really get there, and we want to push them to get to that point. So we built out a syllabus for each one of the participants to go through in this 6-month pilot effort, and we're 3 months in right now. So we went over the headquarters element because we really needed them to identify who was their champion. Because without a champion, it's going to be very difficult to succeed at developing this program. And then we took a look at their strategies of how they're implementing these CSCRM programs, took a look at their roadmap and helped them to align their roadmaps with their senior leadership strategic objectives. And that really helped them to push their programs forward, since they can now show their leadership that their strategy is aligning with what the leadership strategic objectives are. And we're also taking a look at special circumstances with ICS systems. That's going to be in a couple of months. But last week, we went over acquisitions, and that seems to be a very interesting topic across the board because it involves cybersecurity acquisitions and risk management. And, you really need to take all into consideration. We need to break down those barriers of communication between them because they all have a role to play. It's not just an acquisition piece. Acquisitions needs to inform cybersecurity of some of these acquisitions that are going on. We also discuss P cards and some language that needs to be considered, whether it's from the FAR or it's developed outside of the FAR. So so far this pilot has been very informative, and at the end of it, what we really want is to have this overview and guidance with a bunch of lessons learned, and just turn that into something that will be valuable for the federal government for them to implement across. But we're also taking a look at SLTT and small and micro agencies, how to, just kind of exploring with them what CSCRM looks like to them. So we've been in discussions with them about that as well. But, we don't just hand this information over to departments and agencies that are the participants in this pilot. We have a CSCRM consultant that works with them as they go through their homework outlined in the syllabus. And they're there to help them and guide them. They do weekly check-ins. And through this, we're getting a lot of really great information from the participants here. Over.
Fascinating stuff. Kenitra, as someone whose agency has kind of been looped into this pilot, first, can you confirm that you are excited, like Brian is saying, and maybe share a little bit about your experiences so far with the pilot?
So I am going to confirm that we are excited. And, we hear a lot that NASA is the leader in this space and we're doing such great things. But one thing is for sure that there's always the opportunity for improvement. And that is what we are, yes, very excited to participate, because we get to hear where we have those gaps and opportunities, as well as to share with some of our other federal partners. And as Brian alluded to, we really want to get to some consistency so that as government, we know no matter where you go, the requirement is going to be the same, it will be communicated the same. And then our industry partners, we are able to manage the expectations and help them to be successful in helping us to be secure. Over.
I'd love to ask both of you, and maybe this is even one for the entire panel, but Brian, can you kind of tell us what you see as critical areas that foundationally need to be established or addressed when it comes to CSCRM strategies and operationalizing CSCRM programs?
So I'm going to take a quote from one of my colleagues, and it's resonated with me, and that's rules before tools. So having that CSCRM champion is critical to move the CSCRM program forward. And also having that good strategy that you can then push upwards to make sure that your program is going to succeed, and making sure it aligns. So if you have those headquarter elements, those policies and things of that nature, and you're able to essentially drive change down to the other business units that an organization may have, because many are federated, then you start to establish that bidirectional communication and start to impact operations in a positive way. And that will essentially impact cybersecurity, how you tie in cybersecurity with risk management and acquisitions. Over.
Do you have anything to add to that, Kenitra, having been involved in this pilot, or having your own experiences in this space?
Again, I would just have to echo the rules before tools. Don't let the tool drive your operations. Rather, ensure that you are selecting tools that can facilitate the processes that you have documented. Also, starting out in developing your service or your program, this is a huge space, and don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to do it all at once. And I think this pilot is really setting the stage for showing agencies which pieces they should bite off first. In some agencies, they already have a very good documented strategy, so that may be a quick win for them to be able to align it to their CSCRM practices. But having that roadmap, if you will, or that guide, or CSCRM for dummies, if you will, I think is going to be extremely valuable, not just to the government, but also to our industry partners. Over.
First page of CSCRM for Dummies is rules before tools, just in big, bold letters. And I think this goes back to another major factor in creating solid CSCRM or initiatives, and that's obviously creating risk assessments and testing. And Sarah, I'm wondering, can you explain how your team has begun building out cyber risk assessments and testing with a real focus on risk-driven insights?
Yes, thanks. So rules before tools. Yes, I'm all about that. I'm in a rule organization where we are responsible for establishing those rules. So for the past 5 years since I've been with the organization, we've been advocating for cyber risk assessments, but specifically mission-based cyber risk assessments in the form of cyber tabletops, where we bring together engineers, developers, our contractors, our defenders, the operators, and the users of the system with our hackers, our testers, to have a conversation about those systems in a mission context so that we get away from vulnerabilities as a whole and just focus on where are the weaknesses or the areas of concern in those systems. And we always cover supply chain in those discussions. We try to focus on how to help that acquisition program be able to address how do I identify, protect, detect, react, and recover in that supply chain space, because it's so massive, it's so complicated and complex. The attack surface of their end product, their tank, their aircraft, or their ship is completely different than the attack chain of every component in that. The supply chain attack surface is massive. So we try to help them understand that, and we focus in those cyber tabletops on the development environment, the test environment, the production environment, the processes and the tools. So people, processes, technologies, all those things that contribute to cyber supply chain risk, and really try to help them understand where is their greatest risk from a mission perspective rather than the sky is falling and we have to boil the ocean, as Kenitra was getting at, right? We don't want to boil the ocean. We want to be able to help them focus on where in the mission could they be exposing themselves to the most risk? Where is the critical functional software maybe most exposed? And so by doing that, we help drive the focus of where they should drive testing, help the contractor be able to understand where they should maybe flow down some requirements to their subcontractors as well. Over.
And Sarah, you know, I had the pleasure of reviewing some draft guidance that you created around this exact issue for DoD, which I believe we're going to be sending out to the audience so everyone can kind of take a look at this as well. But you know, out of that draft guidance that you drafted, what are some of the main takeaways for supply chain risks? Can you describe the guidance a bit before folks get their hands on it later today?
Yeah, well, so those are slides. That's not the actual guidance, but those are slides drawn from the appendix of the DoD Cyber Test and Evaluation Companion Guide. It's a companion to the overarching DoD Test and Evaluation Guidebook. And that's, of course, a follow-on from policy. So the guidebook helps programs to know what to do. The companion guide is how to do that. So this appendix focuses on that cyber test and evaluation for addressing supply chain risk. So we have 5 activities that in general for cyber test and evaluation that are designed to be iterated and repeated. And they are at the strategic level and they're at the tactical level. So we have examine. So for supply, I'll focus on the supply chain aspects of this. So for examine, we focus on what program information do we have that can help us understand mission, threat, system, the architecture, the software bill of materials. Do we even have a software bill of materials, their parts list? And what we're trying to do is understand what and why in that supply chain to focus on. This is all in that strategic examine activity, which can be repeated at any point. So we're trying to understand, should we focus on where we have inadequate visibility in the supply chain? Or do we have unmanaged risk, like risk that we had a sole supplier, and so that supply chain is fixed and we couldn't do the diversification maybe that we needed? Or if we think we've managed that risk, then maybe where is the criticality so important that we just want to make sure we spot check those areas. So key tools that will have to be implemented to do examine is supply chain illumination tools, in an automated fashion with artificial intelligence enabling it, and there's many out there. And then performing an attack surface characterization. And then what you're ultimately trying to just do is, again, figure out what and why do I need to focus on. Then you move into the planning aspects of the activity-based model. So examine, plan's the second activity. And in plan, the objective is to take all that information from examine and be able to produce contract language for your contractor so that you can hold them accountable for the risk in the supply chain where you want them to focus, and asking them to flow that down as well. And the other aspect is the program has to write a test and evaluation strategy or test and evaluation master plan that says at the high level, what and why, who's going to do that, when is it going to be done, how often is it going to be done, what techniques do they have to use for versus hardware versus software versus firmware type supply chain testing. And just that whole big picture, not at the fine detail, but at the big picture, what's your strategy to do that? And then when the program moves into the next activity is conduct. When they get to conduct, that's when at the strategic level, they perform that mission-based cyber risk assessment and the overall attack surface characterization, but they focus on the supply chain piece of that. And then the test teams come in and they have to now examine all that information to figure out what they're going to test and why in that particular event, write their test plan, conduct their tests, gather their data. And the last two activities are evaluate the data and report. So these are the tactical activities during conduct: examine, plan, conduct the test, evaluate the results, and write the report. And so they iterate through that, however many tests need to get done during that overall conduct activity. And when they're done with that set of tests, maybe it's a time for an acquisition decision, maybe we're ready to move to a different knowledge point, maybe there's an engineering activity that needs to be informed, then the program moves into the strategic evaluate. So stakeholders like my organization, like the the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, we will have access to all of the data from all those tests, the prior exam, and we of course approve their test and evaluation strategies, and we will be able to evaluate how they're doing, right? How are they doing on that supply chain risk? And look at that cumulative body of evidence. And then we also write reports so that the decision authority in the acquisition lifecycle there can make a informed decision about whether or not they're ready to move forward, or the program manager can make a decision whether or not they're ready to move on with a new aspect of the program. So those 5 activities are part of the guide. And then in this appendix, we've specifically tried to describe how to do those activities with a focus on supply chain risks for cyber testing. Over.
So it really goes back to, in a way, what Brian was saying about taking everything that we've learned and now focusing on how to implement these activities in sort of in an operational capacity.
It does, absolutely.
I'm wondering, I mean, you touched on it briefly in a few of your answers, but just to really drive the point home, why is it so important to have a software bill of materials when testing for cyber supply chain risks and vulnerabilities?
Because the F-35 is a flying load of software. So software gets updated, and when it gets updated, we need to understand. So it's like the ingredients. When you go to the store and you buy a product, and maybe you're at risk from you can't have gluten or something, you're very careful to read those labels and know what the ingredients are in that food so that your body doesn't get exposed to something that it shouldn't be. And maybe you later learn that, well, now my body is at risk to a new thing. Then you need to understand what's in your software bill of materials, because now there's a vulnerability, so that you can address that vulnerability, especially if it's critical to the mission. So it's the continuous update of software, the open source software. Most of our software is open source components. Nobody writes from scratch anymore. So that reuse of code and knowing the provenance of that code is incredibly important. So it's just a chance we can't take with our warfighters.
One factor in this entire conversation is obviously the recent White House Executive Order 14028, which we've touched on a bit. Kenitra, how has this recent executive order impacted your work at NASA?
It has revealed a lot of opportunities that we have for improvement. It is definitely something that, as we have identified some of those opportunities, is that proverbial thing that keeps you up at night. But it's also, I think, driven a lot of communication and collaboration, not just within the Office of the CIO, but into our Office of Procurement and Acquisitions, some of our software developers and engineers. So I think that, again, it's really driving, yes, it's definitely a lot of work, not a lot of time to get it done, not a lot of specific guidance, but I think, again, it is an opportunity for us to improve, and also to generate a lot more conversation about supply chain risk management and cybersecurity overall, instead of it just being an OCIO or CIO responsibility. It's an enterprise responsibility, and everyone that's a part of that enterprise or that proverbial village has a part to play. And I think this executive order is really driving a lot of those conversations. Over.
Yeah, and it's interesting. In my reporting, it really does seem like NASA is trying to create that sort of mentality that this is kind of a team-wide effort above just that of it being, the CIO. But curious, how is NASA deciding its next moves around supply chain security when considering the ongoing chip shortage, sort of other new challenges that are emerging in this space? I imagine that must be keeping you up at night as well.
Yes. So we have today what I call the reactive process that we call the Covered Article and Technology Supply Chain Assessment Needed, lovingly known, of course, at NASA, we create our acronym, so it is the CAT scan. And that is a very reactive process where a customer identifies a thing that they need, that product or service, that covered article, and it has not already been through the supply chain risk assessment process and added to what we call the assessed and cleared list. At that point, they go into our ServiceNow instance of our enterprise service desk and enter that CAT scan request, where we then go off and interface with the suppliers, manufacturers, as to the country of origin for that product. We also ask questions related to Section 889, Part A, if it is telecommunications or video surveillance. As Sarah suggested, we do enter it into one of our illumination tools, or two of our tools. One is Interos, the other is BitSight, that is not just focusing on cybersecurity, but also focusing on other risk factors such as geopolitical, financial aspects, and most importantly, being able to do that visualization, that mapping of all of those touch points for that particular supplier or manufacturer. What we are now engaged in, and the chip shortage has really highlighted it for us, is what we're calling a Quad E initiative that focuses on electrical, electronic, electromechanical, and electro-optical parts. So we're talking about things like resistors, capacitors, connectors, microcircuits, transistors, and things of that nature. And what we took a stab at doing, and we're actually going to be presenting it this Friday in a special session of the CISA Proof of Value Pilot, is this Quad E initiative, where we took a step back to, one, identify what was in scope and out of scope of the covered article definition. Where did it make sense for us to really expend the resources to perform those deep dive supply chain risk assessments? And then we took that a step further to identify what fit into those various categories and who were our primary suppliers. And as Sarah alluded to, are they the single point of failure for us? That is something that we definitely wanted to know. Once we did that, we have actually started what we're calling the proactive supplier engagement process, where we have developed, yes, it is a very comprehensive questionnaire, but what we are seeking is to understand their corporate structure, what their supply chain risk management practices are, who their suppliers are. Of course, the important piece, what are all of the products and services that they would like NASA to consider for inclusion in our catalog. And then the last piece is, who are your authorized resellers? Of course, recognizing that we have some that say, we have a very specific set of resellers or distributors, but then we also have that mom and pop that says, hey, I don't really care who sells it. I just need to get my product out there. So those are the things that we're looking at right now, and proactively engaging with those suppliers to brief them on our process, help them understand why we're asking these questions, and again, open up that bidirectional communications where we have a relationship, and it's an ongoing relationship where we want to keep each other protected, such that we don't have another SolarWinds that kind of surprises everyone. Rather, we're already having those conversations. Over.
Yeah, it's interesting because it sounds like a lot of the work that all of our panelists are focusing on involves some level of increased stakeholder engagement. And John, I'm wondering, from your experience, if you can kind of speak to how NIST has sort of been increasingly engaging with stakeholders, or even creating new ways to engage with stakeholders. I believe you touched on it a little bit in your previous answer, to develop this updated guidance.
Engaging with stakeholders, that's kind of our kind of lifeblood. NIST is a fairly small organization, fairly small budget. The office that I work in, the Computer Security Division, is fairly small compared to our colleagues in DHS and some of the other larger organizations, right? So, but we think we punch above our weight, and the way we do that is because we actually rely on smart people to engage with us and tell us what to do, right? So we're great facilitators. We try to be smart when we can be, but that's more in trying to engage with other smart people, right? So that's the only way we can do what we do. We do it in different forms. We do it interagency with different working groups interagency. We do it with external to government stakeholders, both in academia and industry, through different workshops, different fora there. We quite often, if we don't put out formal RFIs, we put out requests for comments on our websites. I would say 1/3 of my job is engaging stakeholders. So 1/3 is doing the research, 1/3 is doing the guidance development, and 1/3 is stakeholder engagement. And so it's kind of what we do. It helps us do our job, and actually it's required for us to do our job. So.
I also want to ask you, John, about the Cyber Summit in late August at the White House. NIST was told to develop a supply chain security framework. What's the status of that guidance, and sort of what were your own main kind of takeaways from the Cyber Summit?
Well, the Cyber Summit happened for a reason. It wasn't just one reason; it was many reasons, and so I think it was a recognition that there are some cybersecurities that still remain. They haven't been solved. And not only that, I think they're getting more frequent. And so cybersecurity, supply chain risk management was kind of highlighted. NIST was tasked with developing a framework. We've been talking internally since then, trying to scope out to some extent what we want to do here. We know that there's a lot of activities in the space, both within the government and in industry. So we're very vehemently against just being another project, another initiative, right? If we're going to have stakeholders, either government or industry, engage on doing something, we want to make it worth their while. So we're trying to figure out what that is, right? It could be either the low-hanging fruit, bringing people together. It could be the hard problem, the moonshot. It could be lots of things. But we actually, again, we want the stakeholders to kind of tell us what they think. We kind of have some ideas, but we want to validate those with stakeholders. I think our initial ideas are that we want to get beyond just providing guidance to acquirers, which is what we have traditionally been. I mean, I've been working in this space roughly 11 years, and it's mainly been providing guidance for organizations acquiring products, right? We want to get beyond that a little bit. Most folks recognize that NIST is the main taskee for the Executive Order 14028, Section 4, which is on the software supply chain. That part really gets beyond the acquire into the development upstream, right? So, but it's very specific to software. So one idea would be to expand that to hardware and services. So moving upstream a little bit. I think another idea would be what sort of evidence or artifacts could be used in a supply chain to increase greater assurance and trustworthiness of not only the technology and the ICT products and services, but just the organizations, right? Because that trust between organizations is essential. So what can we do there that will not expose either the intellectual property from the technology itself or the intellectual property of the actual supply chains, which many companies consider to be intellectual property, right? And market differentiators. So those are some ideas we're kicking around, but we also don't want to get ahead of the ball. So we still have deliverables due from the executive order. We kind of want to build on top of those and not get in front of them. So we are going to start engaging with our stakeholders, which is both government and industry and academia. But we're going to do it in more of a slow, methodical manner. We don't have a deadline or a timeline, which often drives a lot of our work. So that's nice. So we'll be able to kind of see what's out there and hopefully not duplicate it or replicate it, but at least build on top of it.
With that, kind of extended time frame to really iron this out, what have you noticed are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to supply chain risk management? I mean, one thing that I know that we've kind of barely touched on here is information sharing and how exactly information can and should be shared. Is that a challenge? Are there any other things that you've noticed that need to kind of be worked through still?
Yeah, so information sharing is a funny little bugger, right? Because everybody thinks it should happen. Everybody says it's needed. It's the holy grail, but everybody points the finger outward and says they should do it. And that our lawyers are telling us that we can't. And I think a lot of the big challenges are separating the myth from what's real. And I think a lot of the work that DHS, their ICT SCRM Task Force, has done, looking at the liability of information sharing and things of that nature, I'm not sure how new the stuff is, but it's at least putting it down there. I think a lot of the information has been known for a few years now that what can and cannot be shared. I think it's a matter of folks taking a first step forward. And I think there's a hesitation to do that. And I know there's a big want from industry for government to share more information. And again, I think we need to separate myth from reality. I think there's a perception that we have all of sorts of this secret information on all of the boogeymen in the closet. And that's not always the case. A lot of the information you can read in a newspaper, right? A lot of the information we actually get from industry. So it's separating the truth, that's in there on both sides. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges we have.
Hey, Chris, if I could also just kind of add to that, there is a DHS ICT SCRM Task Force, which was a precursor to the Federal Acquisition Security Council, and essentially has working groups that inform the FASC, and it's comprised of evenly shared government representatives and representatives from the IT and communication sectors. And one of the things that was looked at in year one, we are going into year 3 of the activity, but in year 1 was really looking at information sharing, and great group of people leading that. And actually bringing the lawyers to the table, taking a look at what was being suggested as the elements of that shared information. And I think now we're making a lot of progress, and it's more the question of where do we share that information? Who would be the responsible entity to host it and care and feed it? So I think there on the unclassified side, I think a lot of progress is being made. Where I see a bigger challenge with information sharing is that classified information, or our partners over in the intelligence community, where it's not as easy to get access to the information. And it's not as shareable to get the full context. So I think we have two challenges. One, in an unclassified space, where I think that gap is being quickly closed, and it's just a matter of where will we host that information. But I still think we have a huge hurdle to jump over when it comes to that classified intelligence. Over.
Brian, do you notice any of key major challenges outside of what's already been discussed when it comes to supply chain risk management?
I guess in my opinion, it's more organization by organization, whether they're willing to share their information or not. And sometimes I think people hold their information unnecessarily. Maybe it's because they don't want to be exposed or things like that. Maybe, instituting some type of Chatham House rules would be good, but there definitely are challenges, which is why in the pilot, what we've done is we've instituted Chatham House rules so people can speak freely. People can share information freely without having any blowback whatsoever from their organizations, because it's kind of like the Las Vegas rules, right? What happens there stays there. So that's what we wanted our pilot to be. I'm going to put in a little bit of a plug here for the JCDC, which is a CISA initiative stood up by our director, Jen Easterly. And it's bringing public and private sector organizations together to increase that collaboration. Now, JCDC stands for Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. So if you guys want to take a look at that, it's all over the web. Just Google it. Other than that, there are many other forums that are stood up. There is the SCRM Acquisition Community of Practice, which really tries to get together the acquisition elements and expose those to cybersecurity and risk management, so they're better informed. So there's a lot of work being done there. We just had a forum discussion yesterday, and Sean Lobanovitz, myself, and others spoke at the forum, and it was a really great event. And what we did is we started the conversation about, what's next? What is your concern? What keeps you up at night? So we got a lot of really good feedback about that. And then there's also another forum that we've initiated with the ACT-IAC, and that is bringing in government, industry, and academia, so we can leverage each other to get through some of these difficult problems that we face. Over.
Between JCDC and the pilot program, it seems like there are already some programs at play or initiatives at play to kind of address this. What sounds like it must be a culture change needed to kind of separate out that myth between what's real, as John was saying. It seems like
boogeyman.
The boogeyman of the deep fear of giving away information that you're most likely allowed to provide anyway. Right. I do want to make sure that we get some of these audience questions in. We have one from Thomas Smith, and it looks like this is going directed towards Sarah Standard. Will there be opportunities moving forward for other federal agencies to more directly engage with and leverage the Joint Federated Assurance Center capabilities and resources outside the MIL domain?
That's a good question. Thank you for that question. The JFAC, Joint Federated Assurance Center, handles software assurance and hardware assurance and provides capabilities to our acquisition programs that they can then turn over to their contractors. I do not anticipate that we will be extended outwardly to enable others. It's a very tightly controlled capability within the department, but that doesn't mean that we can't, the program offices can't benefit by sharing what they think is valuable with their contractor, with their prime contractors or their developers. That JFAC is actually managed by my organization, the Research and Engineering, the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, but it's on the other side of my organization. So I don't get to have a voice in that, in that per se, and it's not necessarily well used yet. I know that our director for resilient engineering, Ms. Melinda Reed, is working to change that, to try to make it more accessible and usable. I've added a capability to the JFAC, which is called the Centralized Cyber Capabilities Directory. And that directory is a Rolodex of test organizations, of test facility for cyber testing, cyber test facilities, cyber test organizations, and cyber tools, homegrown mostly, or from our FFRDC and UARC partners. It's a means to centrally locate across the services those test capabilities so that we don't reinvent the wheel. And we also enable program managers to know how to make use of what's out there. But that's going to be part of the JFAC. But in general, I don't expect the JFAC will be opened up beyond the .mil. So thank you for the question.
And we have a very real-time kind of experiential question. I'm going to point it to the entire panel. Not sure if we can get a clear answer on this, since I think we would probably need a little bit more information, but this comes from Donna Cohey. I'm a level 1 CO buying for satellite hardware and software. If I'm requested to buy a part that has been on the satellite from the beginning, and I now notice supply chain risk 20 years later, what should happen? And if engineering still tells me to order, who is at fault? I don't think we need to blame anyone, but if anyone has any ideas.
So in the Department of Defense, we are actively working to do modular open systems approach so that when you have something like that, you could easily replace it with a compatible component that meets the modular open systems approach guide standard. So unfortunately, that part probably wasn't. I would replace it. Over.
Sarah, I mean, that kind of gets to another question. How is DoD beginning to kind of increasingly defend software from vulnerabilities or taking on those sort of challenges?
Yeah, so we have several activities going on. We have, of course, there's DevSecOps is, the crazy buzzword everywhere. DoD is working to have their own software factories where we control the containers and all of that development environment, but we can't do all of it. So being able to provide clear guidance on the software bill of materials is one aspect to protect that software development. And then we also, of course, have the JFAC where we have those tools to do the software assurance a little bit more on our own. We do have the NSA has capabilities where they can reverse engineer software at a very deep level, so we can use them. And we have we have a software assurance community practice as well. So there's a lot of initiatives in place. Not to say that we've nailed this one perfectly, but and the CIO, of course, is working actively with our acquisition and sustainment office and our research and engineering office to try to make sure we're all in sync on those rules and then be able to provide better tools.
And, just to end on a high note, I'd love to ask to each of our panelists, and maybe we can go around beginning with Sarah, what are some of the most notable, maybe the most significant improvements being made in this space when it comes to, not just SCRM, but even information sharing? Is there anything that you can point to as a very solid example of where we should be headed?
I wish I could give you that. Information sharing in the department, in acquisition between programs doesn't exist. So we don't even share internally well. So I come back to, those mission-based cyber risk assessments that we're trying to make sure we do universally. We do them across families of systems as well as individual systems, and they have really truly helped to engage the brain of the people who are not in well understanding cyber, right? Helping to educate them and make them a little bit more understanding. So I think the culture change is the most important.
What about for you, Brian?
I think just recognizing that this is a problem across the board is a great step forward, because CSCRM has long been a red-headed stepchild. It's been a problem for many years. We've been at this for a while, John and Kenitra longer than others, and it still exists. And it wasn't just till like a year and a half ago where there was a lot of emphasis placed on this. So this is long overdue. And I'm happy to see all the momentum moving forward. You would have not seen this 3 years ago. So it's just encouraging.
Any thoughts, Kenitra?
I think Brian and I kind of texted last night jokingly that this is definitely job security for those of us in this space. There's something new every day. There are opportunities. I think that's becoming like my tag word, opportunities for improvement, opportunities for growth, collaboration, partnerships. And I think that's going to be the primary thing that we need to focus on are those partnerships and the collaboration. Over.
And John, any final words from you?
Well, those are all tough to follow up. Over the last decade or so, it has been kind of like the Gartner hype cycle. Every couple of years, it becomes sexy, and then people find that it's actually a hard problem, so they go somewhere else. I think with the Secure Technology Act in 2018 and the continued software supply chain attacks that we keep seeing, that it has remained a focus. It's not great to see all those attacks, but at the same time, it's kept our attention on the ball. So I think that's a good thing. And then just echoing my colleagues, collaboration. In terms of information sharing, the Federal Acquisition Security Council and the Secure Technology Act will be requiring departments and agencies to share information internally. So that's a plus. That collaboration on the government industry side, I think, needs to keep going strong.
Got it. Well, this has been a truly informative discussion. I want to thank our panelists, Kenitra, Sarah, John, and Brian for making the time to speak with us today. Thanks again for joining us. We'll be sure to get those slides out from Sarah to the audience for those of you who want to get read in. Thanks for joining us. And again, my name is Chris Riata, and it was an absolute pleasure moderating this discussion.